The dust hadn't settled from the last wagon when Dustin Morrison noticed her across the makeshift dance floor. And in that single heartbeat, everything he thought he knew about keeping his distance from small-town girls shattered like glass hitting stone. It was late summer in 1878, and the annual harvest dance in Owyhee, Nevada, had transformed the usually quiet settlement into something resembling civilization, with lanterns strung between posts and a three-piece band sawing away at their instruments with more enthusiasm than skill. Dustin had only stopped in this silver mining town because his horse needed rest and his supplies needed replenishing, never intending to stay longer than a night, certainly never planning to attend some social gathering where roots got planted and futures got tangled up in expectations he couldn't meet. But his traveling companion, an older ranch hand named Pete who had known his father back in Texas, had insisted that a man couldn't spend his whole life sleeping under stars and eating beans from a can. So here Dustin stood, 24 years old, wearing his cleanest shirt, which wasn't saying much, watching miners and ranch hands spin their girls around while the fiddle player attacked his strings like they owed him money. The air smelled of sage, wood smoke, and the perfume that the ladies had probably ordered special from San Francisco, an exotic blend that seemed out of place in this dusty corner of Nevada, where most things came in shades of brown and gray. She wore a dress the color of desert wildflowers at sunset, something between pink and orange that caught the lamplight and made her stand out among the more conservative blues and greens the other women favored. Her hair, dark as a moonless night, was pinned up in a style that showed off her neck and the delicate curve of her jaw. But it was her eyes that held him captive, even from this distance, bright and intelligent and full of something he couldn't quite name. She was laughing at something her companion, an older woman who might have been her mother, had said, and the sound carried across the crowded space like music, better than anything the band was producing. Dustin felt his feet moving before his brain caught up with the decision, weaving between dancing couples and groups of chattering townspeople. He had never been the type to approach a woman at a social gathering, had never felt that pull that made sensible men do foolish things. His life was the open trail, the next town, the next job moving cattle or breaking horses or doing whatever work needed doing. He had watched his own mother wait year after year for his father to come home from his wandering, had seen how that waiting had carved lines into her face and stolen the light from her eyes, and he had promised himself he would never do that to any woman. But here he was, standing in front of her, hat in his hands like some nervous schoolboy, words dying in his throat as she turned those remarkable eyes on him. Up close, she was even more striking, with freckles dusted across her nose that her powder hadn't quite covered, and a small scar above her left eyebrow that only added character to an already beautiful face. "Evening," he managed, and immediately felt like an idiot for such a weak opening. She smiled, and it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. "Good evening," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that matched her expression. "I don't believe we've met. I'm Abigail Warren, though most folks call me Abby." "Dustin Morrison," he said, finding his voice and some remnants of the charm his mother had always insisted he possessed. "Just passing through, but my friend convinced me to stop by tonight. I'm glad he did." The older woman beside Abby, who had been watching this exchange with the keen interest of a hawk spotting a rabbit, cleared her throat meaningfully. "I'm Martha Warren, Abby's mother," she said, extending her hand. "Are you planning to ask my daughter to dance, Mr. Morrison, or just stand there blocking the breeze?" Dustin felt his face heat, but Abby laughed, a genuine sound free of mockery. "Mama, don't embarrass the man," she chided, though her eyes sparkled with amusement. Then, turning back to Dustin, she added, "But she does have a point. Are you going to ask me to dance? Would you do me the honor?" Dustin asked, the formal words feeling strange in his mouth but somehow appropriate for the moment. She placed her hand in his, and the touch sent electricity racing up his arm. He led her onto the floor just as the band transitioned into something slower, a waltz that required him to hold her closer than the previous reels and jigs had demanded of the other dancers. His hand found the small of her back, proper and respectful, while his other hand held hers gently, as if she were something precious and breakable. "You're not from around here," Abby observed as they began to move, and Dustin was relieved to discover she followed his lead easily, making him look like a better dancer than he actually was. "Texas originally," he admitted, "but I've been traveling for the better part of 6 years now. Taking work where I can find it, seeing what's over the next ridge." "That sounds lonely," she said, and there was no judgment in her voice, just honest observation. "Sometimes it is," he agreed, because lying to this woman felt impossible. "But it's freedom, too. No one telling me where to be or what to do. No responsibilities beyond myself and my horse." "And is that enough?" she asked, tilting her head slightly to look up at him. "Just you and your horse against the world?" It was a question no one had ever asked him quite so directly, and Dustin found himself considering it seriously rather than offering up the easy answers he usually gave. "It has been," he said slowly, "until about 5 minutes ago." He felt her breath catch, saw the color rise in her cheeks, and realized he had been more honest than he intended. But she didn't pull away or make light of his words. Instead, she simply smiled and moved a little closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she had used and feel the warmth of her body through the layers of fabric between them. They danced 3 more songs, talking between the music about everything and nothing. She told him about Owyhee, about how her father had come here during the silver rush back in the 60s, and decided to stay even when the easy money dried up, opening a general store that served the remaining miners and the ranchers who worked the land outside town. She spoke of her love for books, which had to be ordered from back east and took months to arrive, and her frustration with the limited opportunities for women in a mining town where most people assumed she would simply marry one of the local boys and produce babies until her body gave out. Dustin told her about the places he had seen, the mountains of Colorado where snow stayed year-round on the highest peaks, the plains of Kansas where you could see for what felt like forever, the New Mexico deserts where the colors at sunset made a man believe in something bigger than himself. He talked about the cattle drives and the horses he had gentled, and the time he had spent working security for a freight company moving goods between settlements. What he didn't tell her, because he didn't want to see her expression change, was that he had also spent a few months on the wrong side of the law, running with a group of men who took what they wanted and didn't ask permission. He had gotten out before things turned truly violent, before the robberies became murders, but those months still haunted him, still made him wonder about the line between survival and sin. When the band finally took a break, Dustin reluctantly led Abby back to where her mother waited, but he didn't let go of her hand immediately. "Could I see you tomorrow?" he asked, the words coming out rushed and eager. "Maybe take a walk or get coffee or whatever people do around here." Martha Warren's expression suggested she knew exactly what people did around here and had opinions about traveling cowboys with silver tongues, but Abby answered before her mother could voice any concerns. "I'd like that," she said simply. "I help in the store most days, but I can slip away around 2 in the afternoon. Meet me at the Mercantile." "I'll be there," Dustin promised, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. He watched her disappear into the crowd, her mother steering her toward a group of older women who were probably already gossiping about the stranger who had monopolized pretty Abby Warren for nearly an hour. Pete found him a few minutes later, grinning like he had won money on a sure bet. "Told you it wouldn't kill you to be social," the older man said, slapping Dustin on the back hard enough to make him stagger. "That's Abby Warren you were dancing with. Good family. Her daddy runs the general store, honest as they come. Girl's got brains too, from what I hear, teaches some of the younger kids their letters when she's got time." "I'm seeing her tomorrow," Dustin said, and the words felt both wonderful and terrifying. Pete's grin faded into something more serious. "Listen, son, I know you. You're already planning when you'll leave, how long you can stay before the walls start closing in. But that girl in there, she's not the type for a quick romance and a fond memory. She's the settling down type, the building a future type. So if you're not serious, if you're just going to break her heart and ride off into the sunset, maybe think twice about tomorrow." Dustin wanted to argue, wanted to insist that he was just having coffee with a pretty girl. Nothing serious, nothing permanent. But the words stuck in his throat because he knew Pete was right. And more importantly, he knew that what he felt for Abby Warren after just an hour was already more than he had felt for any woman in his entire life. The smart thing would be to skip town tonight, to put distance between himself and this dangerous, wonderful feeling that was blooming in his chest like spring wildflowers after a long winter. Instead, he helped Pete pack up their gear and find a cheap room at the boarding house, and spent the night staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until 2 o'clock. The next afternoon found Dustin waiting outside Warren's general store 15 minutes early, his hair still damp from the bath he had paid extra for at the boarding house. He had even shaved, scraping away 3 days' worth of stubble and nicking himself twice in his nervousness. The store was a solid 2-story structure, unusual in a town where most buildings were single-story affairs built more for function than permanence. Through the window, he could see shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fabric, farming equipment to fancy ladies' hats. Abby emerged exactly at 2, wearing a simpler dress than last night, blue calico that matched her eyes, with a bonnet hanging down her back by its ribbons. Her smile when she saw him was worth every anxious moment he had spent waiting. "Right on time," she said approvingly. "I like a man who keeps his word." "I've been here since 1:45, he admitted, falling into step beside her as she led him down the street toward the edge of town. "Didn't want to risk being late." They walked in comfortable silence for a few minutes, leaving behind the bustle of Owyhee's main street for a path that wound between scattered houses and eventually opened onto the scrubland beyond. The late summer heat was intense but dry, the kind that baked into your bones without the oppressive humidity Dustin remembered from Texas. Mountains rose in the distance, purple shadows against the brilliant blue sky, and somewhere a bird called out a lonely song. "So tell me the truth," Abby said as they walked, her skirts swishing against the dusty ground. "How long are you planning to stay in Owyhee?" "Honestly, I was supposed to leave yesterday," Dustin admitted. "I've got a job lined up in California, working a ranch near Sacramento. They're expecting me in about 2 weeks. And now," she pressed, not looking at him but keeping her eyes on the path ahead. "Now I'm thinking maybe I could spare a few more days," he said carefully. "See what there is to see around here." She stopped walking and turned to face him, the directness in her gaze almost making him step back. "Look, Dustin Morrison, I need you to understand something. I'm not some silly girl who falls for every handsome stranger who wanders through town. I've had my share of suitors, local boys who think a woman's highest ambition should be keeping house and staying quiet. Last night, Dancing with you was the most interesting evening I've had in months, maybe years, and I would very much like to spend more time with you while you're here. But, Dustin prompted, hearing the unspoken word hanging in the air. But I'm not going to pretend this is anything other than what it is, she continued, her voice steady despite the emotion flickering in her eyes. You're a traveling man, and I respect that. I won't ask you to be something you're not, won't try to trap you or guilt you into staying. But I also won't have my heart broken when you leave if I go into this knowing exactly what it is. So I need to know, right now, what you're looking for. The honesty in her words stole his breath. Women in his experience generally played games, hinted at things rather than stating them outright, used tears and manipulation to get what they wanted. But Abby Warren stood before him, clear-eyed and honest, asking him to be equally forthright. I don't know, he said, and it was the truest thing he could offer. I've spent 6 years convinced I wasn't the settling type, that I was my father's son through and through, meant for the road and nothing else. But since last night, since I saw you across that dance floor, everything I thought I knew about myself has gotten all tangled up. So I can't promise you anything beyond right now, this moment, because I don't trust myself to make promises I might not keep. She studied his face for a long moment, and he forced himself to meet her eyes, to let her see whatever truth was written there. Finally, she nodded, as if coming to some internal decision. All right then. We'll take it one day at a time, no promises, no expectations beyond honesty. And when you need to leave, you leave. Deal, deal, he agreed, though even as he said it, something in his chest protested the idea of leaving her at all. They resumed walking, and the tension that had stretched between them eased into something more comfortable. Abby pointed out landmarks, telling him stories about the town and its inhabitants with a wit that kept him laughing. She showed him the ruins of what had been a bigger mining operation before the easy silver ran out, now just skeletal structures being slowly reclaimed by the desert. She took him to a spot where water bubbled up from the ground, creating a small oasis of green in the brown landscape. And they sat in the shade of the few scraggly trees while she told him about her dreams. I want to see San Francisco, she confessed, lying back on the grass with her hands behind her head, staring up through the leaves at the sky beyond. I want to walk on streets that are actually paved, see buildings taller than 2 stories, visit a real library with thousands of books, instead of the dozen or so we manage to keep in circulation here. I want to go to the theater and watch actual actors perform Shakespeare instead of just reading it on the page. Why don't you? Dustin asked, genuinely curious. You're what, 21, 22, old enough to make your own decisions. 23, she corrected, and it's not that simple. My parents need me in the store. My mother's health isn't what it used to be, her heart gives her trouble, and my father can't manage everything alone. I have younger siblings back east, but they've made their own lives. I'm the only one who stayed, and I can't just abandon them because I want to see something beyond these mountains. That's noble of you, Dustin said, and meant it, though he couldn't imagine feeling that tied to any place or person. It's not noble, she said with a slight laugh. It's just life. You make choices and you live with them. I chose to stay, and most days I'm happy with that choice. But sometimes, especially when I meet someone who's been out there, who's seen the things I've only read about, I wonder what I'm missing. They talked until the shadows grew long and Abby reluctantly said she needed to get back before her mother started to worry. Dustin walked her to the store, acutely aware of the curious eyes tracking their progress through town, the whispers that started and stopped as they passed. Small towns were like that, he knew. Everyone invested in everyone else's business, privacy a luxury as rare as rain in the desert. Same time tomorrow, he asked when they reached the store, not quite ready to let her go but knowing he had to. "I'd like that," she said, and the simple pleasure in her voice made his heart skip. He spent the evening helping Pete repair some tack and trying not to think about the job waiting in California, the life he had built around never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments. Pete, for his part, was mercifully silent on the subject, though his knowing look spoke volumes. The next 5 days followed a similar pattern. Dustin would meet Abby in the afternoon, and they would walk or talk or sometimes just sit together in companionable silence. She showed him her favorite spots around town, the places she went when she needed to think or be alone. He told her stories from his travels, carefully editing out the darker periods, the times he wasn't proud of. They attended a church picnic together, and Dustin found himself fending off questions from well-meaning townspeople about his intentions and his plans. Abby rescued him from a particularly persistent matron who seemed convinced he needed to settle down immediately and start producing grandbabies for someone to spoil. "Sorry about Mrs. Henderson," Abby said as they escaped to the relative privacy of the dessert table. "She means well, but she thinks every man and woman between 15 and 40 should be married and reproducing as quickly as possible." "Does she know you're 23 and unmarried?" Dustin asked, helping himself to what looked like apple pie. "I'm surprised she hasn't tried to marry you off to someone already." "Oh, she's tried," Abby assured him with a grin, "but I've successfully avoided every trap she's set. Last year she kept inviting me to dinner and failing to mention that her nephew would be there. Poor boy was as miserable as I was, but she kept insisting we were perfect for each other." "Were you?" Dustin asked, trying to keep his voice casual and failing miserably. Abby laughed and touched his arm gently. "Not even a little bit. He was nice enough, but duller than dishwater." Spent the entire evening talking about wheat yields and the price of feed. I nearly fell asleep in my soup. They spent the evening playing games with the local children, Dustin discovering that Abby was beloved by the younger set, who climbed on her and demanded stories and treated her more like a favorite aunt than a storekeeper's daughter. He watched her with them, saw the patience and genuine affection in her interactions, and felt something shift in his chest that he couldn't quite name. That night, lying in his rented bed, Dustin forced himself to face facts. He was falling for Abby Warren, had probably been falling since that first moment at the dance. The smart thing would be to leave now, before this got any more complicated, before he hurt her or himself worse than was already inevitable. California was waiting, and he had never been the type to break commitments. But when morning came, he found himself at the telegraph office instead of the livery, sending a wire to California explaining that he had been delayed and would be a week late. The ranch foreman's response came back 3 hours later, terse and annoyed but accepting. Dustin paid the fee and walked out feeling like he had just sealed his fate, though whether for good or ill, he couldn't say. He told Abby that afternoon as they sat by the spring again, watching the water bubble up from the depths. "I sent word to California, told them I'd be late." She had been trailing her fingers in the water, but at his words she looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "How late?" "A week, maybe 2 if I push it," he admitted. "They weren't happy about it, but they need someone who knows horses, and apparently I came recommended." "And after that?" she asked quietly. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I keep trying to plan, trying to think beyond today or tomorrow, and I can't. Every time I try to imagine leaving, getting on my horse and riding west, something in me rebels against it." Abby was quiet for a long moment, still watching the water instead of him. "I promised myself I wouldn't do this," she said finally. "Wouldn't let myself care too much, wouldn't set myself up for heartbreak. but I'm finding that promise very hard to keep." Dustin moved closer, taking her hand in his, feeling the calluses from years of working in the store. "I'm not any good at this," he confessed. "At feelings and relationships and all the things that normal people seem to understand instinctively. I've spent so long keeping my distance, not letting anyone get close, that I don't know how to do anything else." "Then maybe we're both learning," Abby said, squeezing his hand. "Because I've spent so long being practical and responsible that I've forgotten how to be spontaneous or take risks. Maybe that's what we're supposed to teach each other." He kissed her then, unable to stop himself, a gentle press of lips that tasted of possibility and promise. She responded immediately, her free hand coming up to cup his face, and for a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, the spring, and the impossible hope blooming between them. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Dustin rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want to hurt you," he whispered. "Then don't," she whispered back, and the simple faith in those two words nearly broke him. The next week passed in a blur of stolen moments and growing intimacy. They talked about everything, sharing secrets and fears and dreams they had never voiced to anyone else. Dustin told her about his father, about watching his mother wait and hope and eventually fade away, about his determination never to put a woman through that same pain. Abby told him about the boy she had loved when she was 18, who had promised her the world and then run off to seek his fortune in California, never even writing to let her know he had arrived safely. "I thought I would die from the heartbreak," she admitted as they sat on the porch of the general store late one evening, the town quiet around them. "For months I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, just waited for a letter that never came. Eventually, I heard through someone else that he had made it to San Francisco, got work on the docks, and married a saloon girl within 6 months of leaving." "He was an idiot," Dustin said fiercely. "Anyone who had you and let you go was the biggest fool who ever lived." "Maybe," Abby allowed. "But it taught me something important. It taught me that promises are just words, and words are easy. It's actions that matter, the choices we make every single day. He promised me forever, but he couldn't even give me 3 months of faithfulness. So I stopped trusting promises and started trusting behavior instead." "And what does my behavior tell you?" Dustin asked, genuinely curious. She considered the question seriously, her gaze distant. "It tells me you're conflicted, that you want to stay but don't know how. That you care about me but are terrified of what that means. That you're running from something, maybe from yourself, and you don't know how to stop." He couldn't argue with any of that because it was all true. "I sent another telegram today," he said quietly. "Told California I wouldn't be coming at all, that something had come up." Abby's head whipped around so fast he was surprised she didn't injure herself. "You did what?" "I can't leave," he said, the words rushing out now that he had started. "I've tried to convince myself that I can, that I'll just ride out of here like I've ridden out of 100 other towns, but I can't. The thought of never seeing you again, of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been if I had just been brave enough to stay, it's worse than any fear I have about settling down." "Dustin," she breathed, and there were tears in her eyes now, glinting in the lamplight spilling from the store windows. "You can't make a decision like that based on a couple of weeks. You'll end up resenting me, resenting this town, feeling trapped and miserable." "Maybe," he acknowledged. "Or maybe I'll finally stop running and discover what it's like to build something instead of always moving on before things get real. I'm not saying I have all the answers, Abby. I'm not even saying I won't panic and do something stupid, but I'm saying I want to try, if you'll have me." She kissed him then, fierce and desperate, and he tasted salt from her tears mixed with the sweetness of her lips. When they broke apart, she was crying in earnest, but she was also smiling. "You're sure?" she asked. "Absolutely certain. Because if you stay and then leave in 6 months, it will destroy me." "I'm terrified," he admitted. "But I'm sure. I want to wake up next to you every morning. I want to help your father in the store and become part of this community. I want to stop running and start living, and I want to do all of that with you." They talked for hours that night, making plans and dreaming dreams. Dustin would find work in Owyhee, maybe at one of the remaining mines or one of the ranches outside town. They would court properly, giving themselves time to be sure, giving the town time to accept him as more than just a passing stranger. And if everything worked out the way they hoped, maybe in a year or so, they would get married, build a life together, create the kind of home Dustin had never thought he wanted. When he finally walked back to the boarding house in the early hours of the morning, Dustin felt lighter than he had in years, as if some burden he had been carrying since his mother's death had finally been lifted. Pete was still awake, mending harness leather by lamplight, and he looked up as Dustin entered. "You're staying," Pete said, not a question but a statement of fact. "I'm staying," Dustin confirmed. "Good," the older man said gruffly. "About time you stopped running from ghosts and started living for yourself. Your daddy might have been a wanderer, but that doesn't mean you have to be. Sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is put down roots." Dustin slept better that night than he had since arriving in Owyhee, his dreams full of dark hair and bright eyes, and a future that no longer seemed terrifying. But morning brought complications he hadn't anticipated. He was having breakfast at the boarding house when a man he didn't recognize entered, scanning the room until his eyes landed on Dustin. The stranger was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who spent their life in the saddle, and there was a badge pinned to his vest that caught the morning light. "You Dustin Morrison?" the man asked, his voice carrying across the dining room and bringing all conversation to a halt. "I am," Dustin said carefully, his stomach sinking. "Something I can help you with, maybe," the lawman said, approaching the table. "I'm Sheriff Garrett from Silver City. Got a telegram yesterday from a marshal in New Mexico asking me to be on the lookout for someone matching your description. Said you might have information about a robbery that took place about 3 years back, freight company office in Santa Fe." Dustin felt the blood drain from his face. He had known his past might catch up with him eventually, had lived with that fear for years, but he had hoped those months running with the wrong crowd were far enough behind him that no one would care anymore. "I wasn't part of any robbery," he said carefully, aware of every eye in the room fixed on him. "I knew some men who were, rode with them for a while before I realized what they were about, but I never participated in any crimes." "That's what I'm hoping you'll come tell the marshal," Sheriff Garrett said, his tone reasonable but his hand resting casually near his gun. "He wants to ask you some questions about the men you were with, what you might know about their whereabouts. Says you're not wanted for anything, just might have information that could help track down the men who are." "And if I don't want to go to New Mexico?" Dustin asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then I'll have to wonder why an innocent man with nothing to hide would refuse to cooperate with the law," Garrett said, his eyes hardening slightly. "Look, son, I don't know you, don't know if you're telling the truth or spinning tales. But I know the marshal asking for you has a reputation for being fair and thorough. He's not looking to railroad anyone, just wants to talk. You come along peacefully, answer his questions honestly, and I bet you're back here within a month or two." A month or two. It might as well have been a lifetime. Dustin thought of Abby, of the promises they had made just hours ago, of the future they had started to plan. He thought about refusing, about trying to run, but he knew that would only make him look guilty and bring more trouble down on everyone in Owyhee, including Abby and her family. "Can I have an hour?" he asked. "To get my things together and say goodbye to some people." Garrett considered, then nodded. "1 hour. But I'll be keeping an eye on the livery, so don't get any ideas about riding out of here. I'd hate to have to chase you down." Dustin found Abby in the store, helping her mother rearrange some new stock that had come in on yesterday's supply wagon. The moment she saw his face, her smile faded into concern. "What's wrong?" He told her everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. He told her about the men he had ridden with in New Mexico. Young and stupid and broke, falling in with a crew that had seemed exciting and dangerous in a way that appealed to his worst instincts. He told her how he had figured out they were planning something big, something violent, and how he had slipped away in the night rather than participate. He told her about the years of looking over his shoulder, wondering if the law or his former companions would catch up with him first. "And now a marshal wants to question me about it," he finished. "The sheriff says I'm not wanted for anything, that they just think I might have information that could help. But Abby, I don't know how long that will take. Could be a few weeks, could be longer if they don't believe me or if they decide I was more involved than I'm saying." Her face had gone pale, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Were you more involved than you're saying?" "No," he said firmly. "I swear to you, I never participated in any robbery or any crime. I was young and stupid and fell in with the wrong people, but I got out before I did anything I couldn't take back. That's the truth, Abby. I know I should have told you before, but I was afraid of exactly this, afraid you would think less of me or send me away." She was quiet for a long moment, and Dustin felt his heart hammering against his ribs, terrified that he had just destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him. Finally, she looked up, and there were tears in her eyes but also determination. "You have to go," she said. "You have to go and tell them everything you know and clear your name properly. Because if you don't, this will always be hanging over us, always be a shadow waiting to fall." "I know," he said miserably, "but I just got you, Abby. I just finally figured out what I want my life to look like, and now I have to leave anyway." "Then you come back," she said fiercely, grabbing his hands. "You go to New Mexico, you talk to this marshal, and then you come back to me. Because I'm not letting you go that easily, Dustin Morrison. You said you wanted to build a life here with me, and I'm holding you to that." "What if it takes longer than a month or two?" he asked. "What if they decide I'm guilty of something and I end up in prison?" "Then I'll wait," she said simply. "I'll wait because I believe you and because I believe in us. And if the worst happens and you don't come back, at least I'll know it wasn't because you ran away but because circumstances prevented it." They held each other for the remaining time, neither speaking, just trying to memorize the feel of being together. When Sheriff Garrett appeared in the doorway, his expression sympathetic, Dustin forced himself to let her go. "I love you," he said, the words feeling both momentous and inadequate. "I should have said it before, should have told you every day since I met you, but I'm telling you now. I love you, Abigail Warren, and I will come back to you." "I love you too," she whispered. "Now go. And for heaven's sake, tell them everything they want to know so you can get back here as quickly as possible." The ride to Silver City took most of the day, Sheriff Garrett proving to be decent company once they were away from the scrutiny of Owyhee. He told Dustin stories about the area, about the mines and the ranches and the various characters who made their home in this corner of Nevada. From Silver City, they took the stage to the nearest railway station, and then spent 3 long days on trains heading southeast to New Mexico. The marshal in Santa Fe turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s named Charles Donovan, with the kind eyes of someone who had seen too much suffering and still believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. He questioned Dustin for hours, going over every detail of his time with the gang, every name and face and conversation Dustin could remember. Dustin held nothing back, describing the men he had ridden with, their habits and hideouts, everything he could think of that might be useful. "Why did you run?" Marshal Donovan asked during one of their sessions, his tone more curious than accusatory. "I heard them planning the robbery," Dustin explained. "They were talking about hitting the freight office, and one of them said that if anyone got in the way, they'd put them down permanent." I realized then that I had gotten in too deep, that these weren't just men living outside the law for the thrill of it, but actual criminals who would kill if they had to. So I took my horse and left in the middle of the night while everyone was sleeping. "Did they come after you?" Donovan asked. "I don't know," Dustin admitted. "I rode hard for 3 days, putting as much distance as I could between us. Changed my route a dozen times in case they were tracking me. Eventually, I made it to Colorado and found work on a ranch, kept my head down and my mouth shut. I've been looking over my shoulder ever since." Donovan studied him for a long moment, then nodded as if coming to a decision. "I believe you, son. Everything you've told me matches up with what we know about that gang and their activities. The robbery went forward as planned, but a clerk got killed in the process. We've been trying to track down everyone involved ever since." Dustin felt sick. If he had gone to the law immediately instead of running, might that clerk still be alive? "I should have said something," he said quietly. "Should have warned someone." "Maybe," Donovan allowed. "But you were scared and young, and you made the choices you thought you had to make to survive. The guilt belongs to the men who pulled the trigger, not to you. What matters now is that you've given us information that might help us finally catch them. Several of the names you provided matched up with men we suspected, but couldn't confirm, and the description of their hideout in the mountains gives us somewhere to start looking. So I can go?" Dustin asked, afraid to hope. "Not quite yet," Donovan said. "I need you to testify before a grand jury, tell them everything you told me. After that, assuming they don't find cause to charge you with anything, which I strongly doubt they will, you're free to go." The grand jury convenes in 3 weeks. 3 weeks turned into 5 when the judge had to postpone due to illness, and then another week for the actual proceedings. Dustin spent the time working odd jobs around Santa Fe, sending letters to Abby every few days and living for her responses. She wrote about life in Owyhee, about the customers in the store and the town gossip, and how much she missed him. She never once suggested that he might not come back or that she regretted believing in him, and her faith sustained him through the anxious waiting. Finally, the grand jury heard his testimony, asked their questions, and declined to bring any charges against him. Marshal Donovan shook his hand afterward, telling him he was free to go and thanking him for his cooperation. Dustin was on the next train north, then west, his heart lighter with every mile that brought him closer to Nevada. He arrived in Owyhee on a crisp autumn evening, the air sharp with the promise of winter to come. The town looked exactly the same as when he had left, but somehow different too, as if seeing it through new eyes. He went straight to the general store, his travel bag slung over his shoulder, his heart pounding so hard he was surprised everyone in town couldn't hear it. Abby was behind the counter, helping a customer with some fabric, and she didn't see him at first. Dustin just stood in the doorway, drinking in the sight of her, memorizing every detail like a man dying of thirst finally finding water. Then she turned, probably alerted by the sudden silence in the store as other customers noticed his arrival, and her eyes met his. The bolt of fabric she had been holding dropped to the floor, forgotten. She made a sound somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and then she was running, actually running across the store floor in a way that would have scandalized the town matrons if any of them had been present. Dustin caught her as she launched herself at him, wrapping his arms around her and burying his face in her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender soap and home. "You came back," she said, the words muffled against his chest. "You actually came back." "I told you I would," he said, pulling back just enough to see her face, to cup her cheeks in his hands and wipe away the tears streaming down them. "Did you doubt me?" "Every single day," she admitted with a watery laugh. "But I kept hoping anyway, kept believing that you were different than the others who left and never came back." He kissed her then, not caring that they had an audience, not caring that half the town would be gossiping about this by morning. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I'm here to stay," he promised. "For real this time, no doubts, no reservations, if you'll still have me." "You idiot," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Of course I'll have you. I've been planning our wedding for the last 2 months while you were gone, drove my mother crazy with all the different ideas." "Wedding," he repeated, his heart skipping. "Well, yes," she said, looking suddenly uncertain. "I mean, that's what you were asking before you left, wasn't it? Or did I completely misunderstand?" "No, you didn't misunderstand," he said quickly. "I just didn't expect you to say yes so easily after everything that happened. Dustin Morrison, I have spent the last 6 weeks wondering if you were coming back or if I was a fool for believing in you. Now that you're here, standing in front of me, asking me to marry you without actually asking, I'm not giving you a chance to change your mind. So yes, I'll marry you, and the sooner the better before anything else goes wrong." He kissed her again, and this time he put everything he felt into it, every ounce of love and relief and joy and terror at the commitment he was making. When they finally came up for air, he was vaguely aware of applause coming from somewhere in the store, and he turned to find that a small crowd had gathered, including Abby's parents, all grinning like fools. Martha Warren was crying openly, something Dustin wouldn't have thought possible from the stern woman he had met at the dance. "Welcome back, son," she said, pulling him into a surprisingly fierce hug. "We were all praying you'd come home." Abby's father, a solid man with shrewd eyes and a careful way of speaking, shook Dustin's hand firmly. "We're going to need to have a talk about your prospects," he said seriously. "Can't have my daughter marrying a man with no way to support her." "Yes, sir," Dustin agreed readily. "I was hoping to find work here in town, maybe at one of the ranches or the mine. I'm good with horses, good with my hands, and I'm not afraid of hard work. As it happens, I could use another hand around the store," Mr. Warren said thoughtfully. "Business has been picking up and I'm not getting any younger. Wouldn't pay much to start, but there's a room above the store that comes with it, and room to grow if you prove yourself." Dustin felt something ease in his chest at the offer. "I'd be honored, sir. Thank you." They talked long into the night, making plans and discussing the future. The wedding would be in 6 weeks, giving time for Abby to finish the dress she was making and for Dustin to prove to the town and to Mr. Warren that he was serious about settling down. He moved into the room above the store and threw himself into learning the business, discovering that he had a knack for dealing with customers and keeping inventory organized. Pete stayed in town too, finding work at one of the ranches and declaring that he was too old to keep wandering anyway. He became a fixture at Sunday dinners, telling stories about Dustin's father that helped Dustin understand the man in ways he never had before. Apparently, his father had tried to settle down several times, had genuinely wanted to be the kind of man who stayed, but some restlessness in his soul had always driven him back to the road. Hearing those stories, Dustin understood for the first time that he wasn't destined to repeat his father's mistakes, that he could choose differently, and that choice was what made him who he was. The wedding took place on a cold December morning, with the whole town packed into the small church to witness the unlikely union of the shopkeeper's daughter and the reformed drifter. Abby wore a dress of ivory silk that she and her mother had spent weeks sewing, with lace at the collar and cuffs that made her look like something from a fairy tale. Dustin wore a new suit, purchased with his first earnings from the store, and tried not to fidget as the preacher went through the ceremony. When it came time to say their vows, Dustin spoke from the heart, promising not just to love and cherish but to stay, to build a life together, to choose her every single day for the rest of their lives. Abby's vows were equally heartfelt, promising to believe in him, to give him room to be himself while building something together, to never let fear or doubt steal their joy. The kiss that sealed their marriage was sweet and full of promise, and the cheers that erupted from the assembled townspeople made them both laugh against each other's lips. They walked out of the church hand in hand, into a world that suddenly seemed full of endless possibility. The reception was held in the same space where they had first met, the town square transformed once again for celebration. They danced their first dance as husband and wife to the same questionable band that had been playing that fateful night, and Dustin held Abby close, marveling at the twist of fate that had brought him to this moment. "Happy?" Abby asked, looking up at him with shining eyes. "Terrified," he admitted honestly. "But yes, happier than I've ever been in my entire life." "You, same," she said with a smile. "But I think being terrified just means we're doing something that matters, something real, and I'd rather be terrified with you than bored with anyone else." They spent their wedding night in the room above the store, their room now, and Dustin discovered that choosing to stay, choosing to commit, didn't feel like a trap closing but like a door opening onto something beautiful and unexpected. In the morning, they woke tangled together, and he watched the sunrise paint colors across her face, feeling a peace he had never known was possible. Life settled into a rhythm over the following months. Dustin learned the ins and outs of running the general store, developing relationships with suppliers, and becoming known throughout the region as someone who dealt fairly and honestly. He and Mr. Warren worked well together, the older man appreciating Dustin's willingness to try new ideas while Dustin valued Mr. Warren's experience and wisdom. Abby continued to help in the store but also started teaching more regularly, the town cobbling together enough funds to pay her a small salary to instruct the younger children in reading and arithmetic. She loved the work, and Dustin loved watching her face light up when she talked about her students' progress. They had their struggles, of course. Learning to live together, to compromise and communicate, proved harder than either had anticipated. Dustin sometimes felt the old restlessness creeping in, the urge to just saddle up and ride without destination or plan. When those feelings hit, he learned to talk to Abby about them rather than letting them fester, and she learned to understand that his need for space didn't mean he was leaving, just that he needed to remember why he had chosen to stay. Abby had her own fears to work through, the terror that one morning she would wake to find him gone, that history would repeat itself despite all his promises. Those fears eased gradually as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, as Dustin proved through his presence and his actions that he meant what he had vowed. Their first anniversary passed, marked by a quiet dinner at home and the news that Abby was pregnant. Dustin's reaction was a complicated mix of joy and terror, the reality of bringing a child into the world making his commitment feel even more weighty and permanent. But Abby's excitement was infectious, and soon he found himself caught up in preparations, converting the small storage room off their bedroom into a nursery and making plans for a future that now included 3. Their son was born the following spring, a healthy baby with Dustin's dark hair and Abby's bright eyes. They named him Daniel, after Dustin's father, because Dustin had finally made peace with his heritage, understanding that he could honor where he came from while choosing a different path forward. Holding his son for the first time, feeling that tiny warm weight in his arms, Dustin understood in a way he never had before what it meant to have something worth staying for. The years that followed brought more children, a daughter they named Alice and another son they called William, along with all the joys and challenges of raising a family in a frontier town. The store prospered under their management, Mr. and Mrs. Warren eventually retiring and leaving the business to Dustin and Abby to run as they saw fit. They expanded the inventory, added a small lending library that quickly became popular and became pillars of the community. Pete remained a constant presence in their lives until his death when Daniel was 10, passing peacefully in his sleep at the ranch where he worked. At the funeral, Dustin spoke about how Pete had been like a second father to him, guiding him toward the life he was meant to live and never giving up on him even when Dustin had given up on himself. Dustin still sometimes thought about the open road, about the life he had left behind. But those thoughts grew less frequent as the years passed, replaced by the daily rhythms of family and community and purpose. He discovered that adventure didn't have to mean constant motion, that roots didn't mean stagnation, and that choosing to stay was its own form of bravery. One evening, when they had been married nearly 20 years and their children were mostly grown, Dustin and Abby sat on the porch of their house, watching the sunset paint the desert sky in shades of orange and purple. The house was one they had built themselves on a piece of land just outside town, with enough space for a garden and a small stable where Dustin kept horses he trained and sold. "You ever regret it?" Abby asked softly, her hand finding his in the space between their rocking chairs. "Staying here, giving up the freedom you had?" Dustin considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked. She had asked it periodically over the years, as if testing to make sure his answer hadn't changed. "No," he said finally. "I regret things I did before I met you, choices I made when I was young and stupid. But staying, choosing you, choosing this life, that's the one decision I've never questioned. Not even a little bit," she pressed, her tone teasing but with an underlying current of real curiosity. "Well," he allowed with a smile, "maybe sometimes I miss sleeping under the stars without 3 kids wanting to know where their other sock is or why they have to do their chores before playing. But that's not the same as regretting building a life with you. Besides, we can still sleep under the stars. We just have to plan it in advance and make sure someone's watching the store." She laughed, the sound as warm and genuine as it had been that first night at the dance. "Remember when we met? You were so convinced you were just passing through, so sure you weren't the settling type." "I was an idiot," Dustin said fondly. "Took falling in love with you to realize that what I thought I wanted and what I actually needed were 2 completely different things." "And what did you need?" she asked, even though they had had this conversation 100 times before in various forms. "You," he said simply. "A home, a purpose bigger than just myself, all the things I was running from because I was too scared to admit I wanted them." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear their children arguing about something trivial, Daniel trying to mediate between his younger siblings with varying success. The sounds that used to make Dustin feel trapped now just made him smile, evidence of the life they had built together. "I love you," Abby said eventually, squeezing his hand. "Thank you for coming back." "I love you too," Dustin replied. "And you're welcome, though I'm not sure I really had a choice. Some part of me knew from that first dance that you were going to change everything." "Was that before or after I stepped on your foot?" she asked with a grin. "Hey, I was trying to be romantic," he protested, but he was grinning too. They stayed on the porch until the stars were bright overhead, making plans for the future and remembering the past. Inside, their children settled down eventually, Daniel reading to his siblings from one of the many books that now filled their home. It was a scene of domestic tranquility that Dustin never could have imagined for himself all those years ago, but which now felt as natural as breathing. The next morning brought its usual chaos of breakfast and getting the kids ready for their various activities. Daniel, now 17, was helping more in the store and showing a real aptitude for the business. Alice, 15, was torn between following her mother into teaching and her dream of becoming a doctor, which everyone insisted was impossible for a woman, but which Abby encouraged anyway. William, the youngest at 12, was obsessed with horses and spent every spare moment in the stable with his father, learning everything Dustin could teach him about training and care. As Dustin worked in the store that morning, helping customers and managing inventory, he thought about the twists and turns that had brought him to this place. If someone had told that restless 24-year-old cowboy that he would spend the next 2 decades in the same town, married to the same woman, running a general store and raising children, he would have laughed in their face. But life had a way of surprising you, of showing you that the things you thought would trap you could actually set you free. That afternoon, a young man rode into town, dusty and tired, and with that familiar look in his eyes that Dustin recognized immediately. The look of someone running from something, or towards something, or maybe just running because movement felt safer than stillness. The young man came into the store looking for supplies, and Dustin found himself offering advice on the best trail through the mountains, the towns where work might be found, all the practical information a traveler needed. But he also found himself saying, "Sometimes the thing you're looking for is in the place you least expect. Don't be so busy running toward the horizon that you miss what's right in front of you." The young man looked at him oddly, probably wondering why a shopkeeper was dispensing unsolicited life advice, but he nodded politely and went on his way. Dustin watched him ride out of town and sent up a silent prayer that the kid would find whatever he was searching for, before he wasted too many years looking in all the wrong places. That evening, the family gathered for dinner as they did every night, a tradition Abby insisted on no matter how busy everyone was. They went around the table sharing stories about their day, and Dustin listened to his children's voices and his wife's laughter, and felt a contentment so deep, it was almost painful. After dinner, while Abby supervised the children cleaning up, Dustin stepped out onto the porch again, drawn by the cooling evening air and the vast desert sky. He thought about all the places he had been, all the things he had seen during those years of wandering. They were good memories, valuable experiences that had shaped who he became. But they paled in comparison to this, to the ordinary miracle of coming home to people who loved him, who knew him completely and chose him anyway. The door opened behind him, and Abby joined him, slipping her arm through his and leaning her head on his shoulder. They stood that way for a long time, not needing words, just being together as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared. "Penny for your thoughts," Abby said eventually. "Just thinking about how glad I am that I turned back," Dustin said. "That I didn't keep riding when every instinct told me to run. Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Abby corrected with a smile in her voice. The best decision was asking me to dance in the first place. Fair point, he conceded, pulling her closer. Though technically, you're the one who told me to ask. Details, she said dismissively, and they both laughed. The children joined them eventually, Daniel carrying blankets and suggesting they all sleep out under the stars like they used to when the kids were younger. It took some coordination to get everyone settled, to find enough blankets and to argue about who got which spot. But eventually, they were all arranged on the porch, looking up at the infinite expanse of sky overhead. Dustin pointed out constellations, teaching William the same lessons about navigation by starlight that he had learned during his traveling years. Alice asked questions about the science of stars and planets that none of them could answer, but which led to a lively debate. Daniel talked about his plans for expanding the store, ideas that showed both ambition and practicality. Abby lay beside Dustin, her hand in his, listening to their children dream and plan and argue. "We did good," she whispered just for him. "We did," he agreed, his throat tight with emotion. "Better than I ever imagined possible." The night grew deeper, and one by one, the children drifted off to sleep under their blankets, their faces peaceful in the starlight. Dustin and Abby stayed awake a while longer, reluctant to let go of the moment, to surrender it to memory. "Do you remember that night after the dance?" Abby asked softly. "When you told me you were leaving, and I convinced myself I was fine with it." "I remember," Dustin said. "I remember thinking I was doing the right thing, the smart thing, protecting both of us from inevitable heartbreak." "And then you came back," she said, wonder still evident in her voice even after all these years. "You actually turned around and came back." "I got about 3 days away," he admitted, a confession he had never quite made in full before. "Made it all the way to the California border, and I couldn't do it. Couldn't make myself keep going when everything in me was screaming to turn around. So I did, turned my horse around and rode back like the devil himself was chasing me." "You never told me that," Abby said, propping herself up on one elbow to look at him. "You said you sent a telegram declining the job, but you never said you had already left." "I was embarrassed," he admitted with a rueful laugh. "Felt like an idiot running away and then running back. But I couldn't do it, Abby. Couldn't leave you behind and spend the rest of my life wondering what if." "I'm glad you're an idiot then," she said, kissing him softly. "My idiot." They fell asleep eventually, surrounded by their sleeping children, under the same stars Dustin had once thought represented freedom. He understood now that real freedom wasn't about having no ties, but about choosing which ties to forge, which commitments to honor, which loves to nurture. The open road would always be there, waiting for anyone who wanted it. But here in this place with these people, Dustin had found something worth more than all the adventures in the world. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges, but also deepening the bonds between them all. Daniel eventually took over the store completely, allowing Dustin and Abby to step back and enjoy a slower pace of life. Alice did become a doctor, studying in San Francisco, and then returning to Owyhee to open a practice, proving that determination and talent could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. William started a horse breeding operation that became known throughout Nevada for producing quality animals. Dustin and Abby grew old together, their hair turning gray and their bodies slowing down, but their love remaining as strong as it had been that first night. They took to sitting on the porch most evenings, watching their grandchildren play in the yard and marveling at the legacy they had built together. On their 40th anniversary, the whole town threw them a party, recognition of the role they had played in Owyhee's growth and prosperity. People came from miles around to celebrate, sharing stories about how Dustin and Abby had helped them through hard times, had given them credit when money was tight, had offered advice and support and friendship without judgment. Speech. Someone called out, and the crowd took up the chant until Dustin reluctantly stood, Abby beside him. "I'm not much for speeches," he began, and good-natured laughter rippled through the assembly. "But I want to say thank you. Thank you for accepting a drifter who didn't know what he wanted and giving him a chance to figure it out. Thank you for welcoming me into this community, even when I didn't deserve it. And most of all, thank you for this woman beside me, who saw something in me I couldn't see in myself and loved me anyway." He turned to Abby, taking both her hands in his. 40 years ago, I was a man running from everything that scared me, convinced I was meant to be alone. You changed all that, Abby. You showed me that courage wasn't about never being afraid, but about facing your fears and choosing love anyway. Everything good in my life, everything I'm proud of, started the night I saw you across that dance floor and decided to be brave. There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd by the time he finished, and Abby was crying openly, not bothering to hide her tears. "I love you," she said simply. "Then, now, and always." They kissed to thunderous applause, and the party continued long into the night, filled with music and dancing and laughter. Dustin danced with Abby, with his daughters and daughters-in-law, with his granddaughters, each dance a celebration of the life they had built together. As the party wound down and they made their way home through the quiet streets, Abby leaned heavily on Dustin's arm, tired but happy. "No regrets?" she asked her ritual question. "Not a single one," he answered, his ritual response. "Best life I could have imagined." "Even better than all those places you wanted to see," she teased. "All those adventures you gave up. I got to see them anyway," he pointed out. "Through our children, through their stories and their journeys, and I got to come home to you every night. That's an adventure worth any sacrifice." They reached their house, the one they had built together all those years ago, and stood for a moment looking at it. It wasn't fancy, just a simple structure of wood and stone, but it represented everything they had created together. Home. Family. Love that had weathered time and trouble and come out stronger. "Come on, old man," Abby said affectionately, tugging him toward the door. "Let's get you to bed before you get all philosophical on me." "Old man," he protested with mock indignation. "I'll have you know I can still dance circles around half the young men in this town." "Of course you can, dear," she said soothingly, and they both laughed as they went inside. That night, lying in bed with Abby curled against his side, Dustin thought about the path that had led him here. All the choices, good and bad, that had shaped his life. The wandering years that had taught him about the world and himself. The moment of recognition at the dance when he saw Abby and knew, somehow, that everything was about to change. The decision to leave and then the harder decision to turn back. The years of building a life together, of learning and growing and becoming someone he could be proud of. "Abby," he whispered into the darkness, wondering if she was still awake. Came the sleepy response. "Thank you for waiting for me," he said, "for believing I'd come back, even when you had every reason not to." She shifted, moving closer, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Thank you for turning around," she whispered back, "for being brave enough to choose love over fear." They fell asleep that way, as they had for 40 years, together in the darkness, secure in the knowledge that when morning came, they would wake up together too. It was a simple thing, really, sleeping beside someone you loved, but Dustin had learned that the simple things were often the most profound, the most worth cherishing. The seasons continued their endless cycle, and Dustin and Abby continued growing older together, their love maturing into something deep and unshakable. They watched their grandchildren grow, delighted in the arrival of great-grandchildren, and remained active parts of the community they had helped build. On a spring morning when Dustin was 72 and Abby 71, they took a walk to the place where they used to go when they were courting, the little spring where water bubbled up from the earth. It was harder to make the journey now, their bodies not as willing as they once were, but they were determined to visit one more time. They sat under the same scraggly trees, now a bit larger but still fighting the desert climate, and looked at the water sparkling in the sunlight. So much had changed since that first walk together, yet this place remained the same, constant and eternal. "I'm glad we came," Abby said, leaning against Dustin's shoulder. "It's good to remember where we started." "We started at a dance," Dustin corrected with a smile. "This is where we decided to keep going." "True," she acknowledged. "The dance was the beginning, but this is where we chose each other, really chose, knowing it wouldn't be easy but believing it would be worth it." "And was it?" Dustin asked, even though he knew the answer. "Worth it, I mean." "Every single day," Abby said firmly. "Even the hard ones, even the days when we fought or struggled or wondered if we'd made a mistake. It was all worth it because we did it together." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable in each other's presence in the way only people who have spent decades together can be. Birds sang in the branches above them, and a breeze carried the scent of sage and wildflowers. It was a perfect moment, crystalline in its simplicity. "Dustin," Abby said eventually, her voice thoughtful. "Yes, love, if you could go back, knowing everything you know now, would you still turn around? Would you still choose this life over the freedom of the road?" He didn't have to think about his answer. "Every time," he said firmly. "1,000 times over, I would make the same choice. You gave me something better than freedom, Abby. You gave me a reason to be free, a purpose for all that space and possibility. Without you, the road was just running. With you, life became something worth living." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, a kiss that held 40 years of love and partnership and shared history. When they pulled apart, there were tears on both their faces, but they were happy tears, grateful tears. They made their way back to town slowly, stopping often to rest and to admire the view. Owyhee spread out below them, larger now than it had been when Dustin first arrived, but still recognizably the same town. Smoke rose from chimneys, children played in yards, and life continued its eternal rhythm. That night, surrounded by family at a dinner Alice had organized, Dustin looked around the table at all the faces he loved. His children, now middle-aged with families of their own. His grandchildren, some nearly grown themselves. His great-grandchildren, the newest generation carrying their legacy forward. And beside him, always beside him, Abby, her hand in his as it had been for more than 40 years. "I want to say something," Dustin announced, tapping his glass for attention. The room quieted, everyone turning to look at him. "I want all of you to know how grateful I am for this life, for this family. There was a time when I thought I was meant to be alone, when I couldn't imagine anything worse than settling down and putting down roots. But your grandmother, this remarkable woman right here, she showed me that home isn't a trap. It's a treasure. And all of you, everyone at this table, you're the proof that taking a chance on love was the best decision I ever made." "Hear, hear," Daniel called out, and the sentiment was echoed around the table, glasses raised in toast. "To family," Abby added, her voice strong and clear. "To the choices that shape us and the love that sustains us. And to second chances, because sometimes we get things wrong the first time and need the wisdom to turn around and try again." They all drank, and then the room dissolved into happy chaos as conversations resumed and children demanded more dessert. Dustin sat back, content to watch rather than participate for a moment, marveling at what he and Abby had created together. As the evening wound down and family members began heading home, Dustin and Abby stood on their porch waving goodbye, watching until the last wagon disappeared into the darkness. Then they went inside, banking the fire and preparing for bed, their movements synchronized by decades of practice. "Another good day," Abby observed as she brushed out her hair, now more silver than dark. "The best," Dustin agreed, watching her from the bed. Even after all these years, even with age taking its toll on both of them, he still thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She joined him in bed, nestling into the curve of his body as naturally as breathing. "Love you," she murmured, already half asleep. "Love you too," he replied, holding her close. "Thank you for making me turn around." "Thank you for being willing to," she whispered back, and then sleep claimed them both. Dustin lived to see 83, and Abby passed just 2 years later at 82. They had been fortunate, living long, full lives and maintaining their health and faculties until nearly the end. When Dustin's time came, he was surrounded by family, and his last words were, "I'll wait for you," a promise to Abby that death wouldn't truly separate them. Their funeral was the largest Owyhee had ever seen, people coming from all over Nevada and beyond to pay their respects to the couple who had become legendary in the region. Story after story was shared about their kindness, their generosity, their example of what love and commitment could look like when tended properly. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the town, their graves marked with simple stones that read Dustin Morrison. He chose love, and Abigail Warren. She believed. It was a fitting tribute to a love that had started with a dance, survived separation and doubt, and ultimately created a legacy that would live on through the generations they left behind. Years later, their great-great-grandchildren would visit those graves and hear stories about the traveling cowboy who met a girl at a dance, rode away but couldn't forget her, and turned back to build a life that became the foundation for entire family. They would learn about the power of choosing love over fear, of believing in second chances, of understanding that home isn't where you start but where you choose to stay. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the desert wind blew just right, people swore they could hear music drifting across the town square, as if somewhere, somehow, Dustin and Abby were still dancing together under the stars, their love story continuing into eternity.